have I got a cancer or what, but it is not. Benign is a non-malignant enlargement of the prostate gland. As we can see, the age prevalence, it usually begins from the age of 50 to 60, and gradually the incidence increases as the age of the patient increases. At the age of 90 years, it is estimated that almost 100% of all males will have a benign enlargement of the prostate gland. However, amongst the males who develop the enlargement of prostate, only 50% of them will actually develop clinical symptoms. And out of them, only 1 out of 10, that is hardly 10% of them, may require surgery in the future. So the pathophysiology for BPH, it is basically a multifactorial and a complex phenomenon. The role of DHT, that is dihydrotestosterone, is well known in the enlargement of the prostate. As dihydrotestosterone is only present in males and the prostate is only present in males, so this will affect only the males and not the females. It is basically the testosterone which acts as an agonistic thing, which results in cell proliferation. And as the age advances, there is some imbalance leading to the drop in the antagonistic signals and causing enlargement of the prostatic cells. As you can see in this figure, the prostate is located just below the bladder and the urethra passes through the prostate. So as these arrows indicate, as the prostate enlarges, there will be compression of the urethra. We will come to that later. So sharing with you the basic anatomy of the prostate gland. As you can see, the prostate is a walnut-shaped gland located just below the bladder neck and engulfing the urethra. This part of the urethra is also called as the prostatic urethra because it passes through the prostate gland. As the prostate starts enlarging, we can see here that the urethra gets compressed. Once the urethra starts getting compressed, that gives rise to the symptoms in the patients and internal changes in the urinary bladder. So, coming to the presentation, once the prostate starts compressing the urethra, the urinary bladder also gets hypertrophied and resulting in clinical symptoms which are known as lower urinary tract symptoms or LUTS. The LUTS are of two main types. One is the obstructive symptoms and the other is the irritative symptoms which the patients usually complain. The patients usually come to us with both the type of symptoms. The obstructive symptoms are actually due to the obstruction in the urine outflow resulting in bladder outlet obstruction, and the irritative symptoms are usually due to detrusor overactivity which result in due to the filling of the urine in the urinary bladder. So the LUTS, which are also called as storage symptoms or the irritative symptoms, are typically increase in the frequency of urine. The patient has to go to pass urine more number of times. Urgency, that is a desire or inability to hold the urine for some time, especially during traveling. Nocturia, that is getting up in the night to pass urine more than 2 to 3 times per night. And urge incontinence. Like patients many a times do complain that before going to the bathroom, they have a sudden episode of urgency and they actually leak a few drops of urine in their clothes. The other type of symptoms are known as the obstructive or voiding symptoms, which typically include a weak stream of urine due to the compression of the urethra, terminal dribbling because the urine is not getting emptied completely, few drops do remain back and then they come out after the act is over. Hesitancy, that is the patient takes a long time to pass urine or a long time to initiate the urinary flow. Also, the urine flow may not be continuous. It will come in few spurts, it will stop. The patient may strain to pass urine. Patient has to wait in the bathroom for a longer period of time, and all these complaints which they come to us with. The BPH is a chronic progressive disease and which, if left untreated, may result in complications, of which some can be really very severe. The commonest complications resulting due to BPH are the urinary tract infections, urinary incontinence, that is leakage of the urine, renal impairment, that is affection of the kidneys due to chronic back pressure changes due to obstruction in the urinary stream, bladder stone, urinary retention, that is sudden stoppage of the urine, and of course the need for surgery. As per our guidelines, AUR, that is acute urinary retention, and the need for surgery are two distinct endpoints in the progression of BPH. As we can see in this figure, once the prostate starts enlarging, the secondary changes start taking place in the urinary bladder, which results in the bladder stone, which may result in bladder diverticula, which will result in hypertrophy of the bladder wall, which may result in back pressure changes, which lead to renal failure. So if left untreated, all these changes will be likely to happen. Coming to the clinical evaluation, when the patient presents to us, we commonly ask the patient about the IPSS, that is International Prostate Symptom Score. It is a rough guideline to assess the severity of the BPH complaints which the patient has. It has 7 components and each component is rated from 0 to 5. So total of maximum score will be 35. The minimum score will be 0. The questions are usually like, over the past 1 month, do you have a sensation of not emptying your bladder completely? The second question will be, you will have to go again and again, that is within less than 2 hours, do you have to go to pass urine? How many times you have often stopped and started your urination again? How many times have you found it difficult to postpone, that is the urgency, the weak stream, again hesitancy or straining to void, and how many times do you get up in the night? We get a rough assessment based on this score, which can be further, or there is also one more score which is known as a quality of life question, which will be rated from 0 to 8. Based on the IPSS score, we can classify the symptoms of BPH as mild, moderate, and severe. Mild will be ranging from 0 to 7. Moderate symptoms we can call when the score is between 8 to 19, and severe is 20 and above, that is 20 to 35. This can give an assessment, because after starting the patient, when we call the patient on medicines, after we call the patients after surgery, we call the patients after medicine for a follow-up, we do assess the score again, and then we compare whether the patient has progressed, whether our treatment was effective, is he likely to require anything else. So this can be used on an OPD basis by all of us. Coming to the examination of the patient, apart from a general examination and all the vitals, I will be sharing with you a few specific points as regards to examination of a patient with BPH. First should be a focused neurological examination, because the complaints of lower urinary tract symptoms can also be seen in other neurologic conditions, like a patient with cerebrovascular accidents, patients with Parkinson's disease, spinal cord disorders, neural trauma, psychogenic, and other causes need to be excluded before labeling a patient of BPH. The other examination what we do as a urologist is also known as DRE, which is a digital rectal examination, where we do a per rectal examination of the patient and assess the size of the prostate, the consistency of the prostate, and the rectal mucosa, because DRE forms an important evaluation to exclude cancer of the prostate. The other investigations what then everybody or we all order are the serum PSA, which is also known as the prostate specific antigens. The normal range will be between 1 to 4. The sonography with post-void residual urine, a normal urine analysis, and a uroflowmetry. I will be covering a few important points regarding these investigations. In the meantime, the other investigations like urodynamic studies, diagnostic cystoscopy, or a filling cystometry, they are not at all recommended routinely. These are to be done only in special circumstances where the diagnosis of BPH is still in doubt, even after doing all the other necessary investigations. So coming to the investigations, as per the diagnostic guidelines led by our Urologic Society of India, the recommended investigations in all patients of suspected BPH on an OPD basis will be a serum PSA, a urine analysis, uroflowmetry, creatinine, and a simple abdominal sonography. However, the instructions for the sonologist should be very specific so as to mention the prostate size, the kidneys, and most importantly, the post-void residue urine, that is the PVR. Many a times it is not mentioned in the sonography. So as practitioners, we all should insist. And as I said, non-prostatic causes of symptoms can be excluded by a detailed history, physical examination, and also a urine analysis. Coming to the specific investigations, the PSA is a commonly done investigation. Even nowadays, they have included PSA in normal routine health checkups also. Many a times patients do come with us with a PSA value, which may be a little bit more than 4, which may be 5, 6, and they are really very concerned about it. So basically what is PSA? It is a tumor marker used for screening of cancer prostate, and it is usually considered optional in the evaluation, but we all will usually include it at the time of initial investigation itself. The things to be known about a PSA, it is basically an enzyme which is secreted by the prostatic tissue and it circulates in our serum and blood. The normal value as recommended is usually less than 4 nanogram per ml, and its level rises with the increasing age and the size of the prostate gland. However, a one-time reading of PSA is not very specific, and we need to evaluate the PSA repeatedly over a period of 2 to 3 months to see the trend in the PSA, whether it is rising, whether it is remaining the same, or whether it is falling. One test out of range could be caused by other problems, and PSA is not very specific for cancer prostate. What are the other factors apart from cancer of the prostate which may give rise to a raised serum PSA, and which is the most common thing which we see in our clinical practice? Because per se the cancer is actually very rare. So the commonest causes for raised serum PSA will be, apart from CA prostate, a normal benign enlargement of the prostate with a very large gland will give rise to PSA levels which will be more than 4. Prostatitis or urinary tract infection or infection in the prostate gland will give rise to a raised serum PSA. Instrumentation like a simple catheterization which may have been done during episode of retention, or the patient must have undergone a cystoscopy or attempts to catheterization. This itself will cause rise to in the level of serum PSA. DRE, that is a digital rectal examination done before collection of the sample, will also give rise to the serum increase in the levels of serum PSA. The increasing age and also recent ejaculation will also give rise to a raised serum PSA. Very rarely do we find the serum PSA levels to be very low, like nearing about 0 or 0.1, which usually happens when the patient is on LHRH agonist as a treatment for CA prostate, or if he is receiving 5-alpha reductase inhibitors for a very long period of time. So these are the main things which should be kept in mind as regards the serum PSA. So the most important out of this as a take-home message is that not all PSA increase is related to the cancer prostate, but it is more commonly due to other factors rather than a cancer. The next specific investigation is a uroflowmetry. Uroflowmetry, or the short form as we call it as UFR, is actually the electronic recording of the urinary flow rate throughout the course of the act of maturation. The results of uroflowmetry, however, are not very specific for the prostate, but it gives a rough idea about the type of and the pattern of voiding of the patient, and it can be used as a follow-up investigation after treatment. This is the normal uroflowmeter graph. The patient starts his maturation, the stream increases, gradually it comes down, and then the stream ends. So the points to be noted here are the maximum flow rate, average flow rate, the time taken to pass urine, the voiding volume, that is the amount of urine which he has passed, and the pattern of the curve. These are the commonly seen 3 types of curves. The first type, as I said, is a normal bell-shaped curve, which the stream increases immediately, and then once it is done, the stream ends. The second type of a curve is typically seen in benign enlargement of the prostate, which takes a long time to void. The flow is very high. And a third is typically seen in a urethral stricture, whereby the patient is very long with a very poor stream. The next investigation specific for the prostate in our OPD is a sonography. Usually nowadays the patients come to us with a sonography report in their hand. The patients get it done by themselves, and what we have to see are basically these 3 parameters as I had discussed earlier: the prostate, the size of the prostate, the echogenicity, capsule and an intravesical protrusion. The status of the kidneys to see for any hydronephrosis bilateral, which may indicate a back pressure changes, and importantly the bladder, where the bladder wall is thickened or not, the presence of post-void residue in the urine, presence of bladder diverticulum, any other pathology like a bladder stone, or any other actual growth which can be seen on the images of sonography. On the sonography, many a times the radiologists give us the size of the prostate, which can be either given in cubic centimeters, that is cc, or in grams. Both mean the same thing. The classification, what we classify it as, usually less than 20 grams, it is a small prostate or a normal size gland. Between 20 to 40 is a medium or a moderate size enlargement, and more than 40 or 50 grams is a large size prostate. Some radiologists also give us the intravesical protrusion, the median lobe of the prostate, and which is graded into grade 1 as 0 to 5 mm, grade 2 is 6 to 10 mm, and grade 3 is more than 1 centimeter protrusion inside the bladder. Now, the most important thing is the size of the prostate correlates not very well with the degree of obstruction. Like a patient may have a very, very large size of the prostate, but will remain absolutely asymptomatic throughout. As against that, many patients with even a small prostate will come to us with retention of urine, and he may not be managed on medical treatment, and he may require surgery. So, even a small prostate, as I said, can obstruct, and a large prostate may not obstruct. This is because of the effect which is known as the funneling effect of the bladder neck, and a small nodule which may sit at a strategic position, that is right at the opening of the bladder neck, which may give rise to obstruction during passage of urine, which is known as a ball valve type of obstruction. The last parameter to be seen is the post-voidal residue. After completion of urination, how much amount of urine remains inside is one of the factors to be considered while evaluating a patient with BPH. A normal person with no significant obstruction should have residual urine which is near to about nothing, that is 0 ml. However, we generally consider it as about 50 ml of residual urine to be normal, because many a times once the patient goes for sonography, he drinks a lot of water, he waits till his turn comes, till the other patients get over, he is asked to pass urine and come back again, and in all that some amount of urine may remain inside. So generally about 50 ml we consider it as normal. However, even after persistent measurement, if the value remains above 100 ml, then that is the time when we label it as a significant post-void residue. Also, residue urine of more than 100 ml and on the uroflowmetry with a flow rate of less than 10 ml per second is usually goes in favor of obstruction. So this is how we evaluate the patient on an OPD basis, a case of benign prostatic hyperplasia. Once all this evaluation is done, we generally classify the patient as whether he is suffering, whether he has mild complaints, whether he has moderate complaints, or he is actually in retention or whatever, and then we decide our basis of treatment. Coming to the treatment part now, the treatment options are broadly divided into watchful waiting, medical therapy, and of course surgery. The gold standard is TURP, and many other minimally types of invasive surgery like lasers, HoLEP, KTP, etc. And as per the 2010 American Urological Association guidelines, it is recommended that surgery should be performed if patient develops complications like LUTS, that is lower urinary tract symptoms, which are refractory to other therapies, a retention if patient fails at least one attempt of catheter-free trial. We will discuss this in a bit more detail. Coming to the management of benign prostatic hyperplasia, many patients when diagnosed with BPH, if they are having very mild symptoms like the score is between just 0 to 7 or just an incidental diagnosis of prostatic enlargement, many a times we do not start the patient on treatment and we ask them to observe for next few months. As we can see, the trend in the management beginning from the early 90s to almost 2000, the red line indicates the need for surgery, and these white bars are indicating the management based on drugs. As we can see, as the years progress, the need for surgery is actually coming down till it has plateaued after about 98 to 2000. This is because of development of more effective drugs, which are very well, on which the patients can be managed very well without the need for surgery. In 2000, the majority of the patients are now being managed medically, and only about 10% of them do actually require surgery. Coming to the medical therapy options, there are two components in prosthetic enlargement: the static component and the dynamic component. This is important because the type of drugs what we give, they act on these two factors in the prostate gland. The static component is actually the bulk of the prostate, by which the prostate enlarges, and it actually results in compression of the urethra. The dynamic component is by the alpha receptor overactivity, which results in contraction of the prostatic smooth muscle, which results in a compression of the bladder neck. And yes, both of them can be tackled by drugs. However, both the drugs are of separate classes, and we will discuss that. Both these drugs can also be given in a combination, which is known as a combination therapy. Coming to the drugs specifically, this is just to show the increased smooth muscle tone in the prostate will result in the compression of urethra, and also the hypertrophy will directly compress the opening of the urethra. So the alpha blockers will act on the muscle tone, while the 5-alpha reductase inhibitors like dutasteride and finasteride will act on the hypertrophy, that is, they will prevent the actual enlargement in the size of the prostate. So this is how the alpha receptors are distributed in the prostate. The predominant type of alpha receptors are the alpha 1A type, which are 70%, and 1D type, which are about 30%. Usually they are present in the region of the bladder neck and the prostate and a part of the urethra. So this is the type of alpha 1A receptors which are blocked by the alpha blockers, and which give immediate relief to the in the symptoms of the patients. The alpha blockers are the most commonly used drugs. The commonest used alpha blockers are alfuzosin, tamsulosin, and silodosin. These are the three commonest used alpha blockers. Previously used drugs like doxazosin, terazosin are usually not used nowadays, except in very old patients with concomitant hypertension, in which terazosin is still prescribed. The mechanism of action of alpha blockers is they block the adrenergic overactivity, because we have already seen that the smooth muscle distribution in the prostate, it reduces the tone of the smooth muscles, and which improves the urinary flow because of relaxation of the bladder neck. Once the smooth muscles are blocked, they get relaxed and they are driven away from the opening, resulting in the passage of urine flow. So this is how the alpha blockers act. As I had said, there are three main types of alpha blockers: alfuzosin, tamsulosin, and silodosin. However, each of them has very specific characters also. All are almost equally efficacious. That means any drug which can be given to the patient, it will produce the desired effect. However, silodosin, being a very highly selective alpha blocker, is very more potent than either tamsulosin or alfuzosin. What we have to consider while giving treatment to the patient is the side effect profile also, because the patients may be on the treatment for many years altogether, practically lifelong also. So the side effect profile will form our major contention for deciding the type of drug. The commonest side effect seen with alfuzosin is the postural hypotension, because alpha receptors are also present on the blood vessels in the body. Blockage of them will result in blood vessel dilatation, which may result in fall in the blood pressure, typically seen when rising up from a sitting or a sleeping position. It also may interact with PDE5 inhibitors, which are used for erectile dysfunction or other conditions. The tamsulosin will only cause postural hypotension, a little less than alfuzosin. And silodosin, because it is a highly selective alpha blocker, it usually acts only on the prostate gland and not anywhere else on the body. It is a very safe drug. However, the commonest side effect will be retrograde ejaculation. That is, after ejaculation, the patients say that they do not discharge semen, but it is just a dry ejaculation. And this happens because the bladder neck remains open, which is a part of the mechanism of action of this drug. All these drugs are given once a day to the patient. Typically, the patients take it at bedtime because initially it was started to prevent postural hypotension so that the patient can take the drug and go off to sleep, so that there are less chances that he may suffer from postural hypotension, which happens usually in the initial part of the drug effect. But nowadays, we ask the patient to take the drug as per his convenient time. Diet does not affect this drug intake, and patient can take it either before his meals or after his meals as per his convenience. The patient profile, which we, in the order which we prefer the drugs, alfuzosin is usually given in patients who are slightly younger and more sexually active, because it has got a very less chance of causing retrograde ejaculation. It is sometimes very disturbing for the patients that after ejaculation there is no semen discharge, and hence in younger patients we usually prefer alfuzosin. Tamsulosin can be given in any age group. For patients between 45 to 55, 60 years of age, it is a very safe drug. Though postural hypotension does occur, it happens only in maybe 1 or 2% of the patients. And silodosin is usually reserved for patients with severe symptoms, patients who are not very happy with tamsulosin or alfuzosin, elderly patients with less of sexual activity, and patients with associated cardiovascular complaints like untreated hypertension, myocardial infarction, ischemic heart disease, because being a selective alpha blockers, it is very less likely to interact with the blood vessels and cause hypotension. Coming to the combination therapy, the rationale for combination therapy is that 5-alpha reductase inhibitors, 5-ARI, which is dutasteride or finasteride, which commonly comes as a combination with tamsulosin or silodosin. Usually the tablets are labeled as plus or D or F, whatever. So these arrest the disease. That means they actually prevent the enlargement of the prostate by arresting the cell division. And taken over a long period of time, they cause a reduction in the size of the prostate gland. Alpha adrenergic blockers, that is tamsulosin, silodosin, which we have seen, they act very rapidly, and in a day or two itself, the effect starts, and the patient, if he is responding, the patient usually reports back to us saying that yes, he is much better than what he was around 10 days back. Both these drugs once combined, it acts as a synergistic to one another. It arrests the disease progression, and it rapidly relieves the symptoms also. The rationale is, again, as I said, alpha blockers, they improve symptoms, increase the urinary flow by relaxing the prostatic and bladder neck smooth muscle. And the alpha reductase inhibitors improve symptoms by actually reducing the prostatic enlargement. However, 5-alpha reductase inhibitors to actually cause effect take a very long time. So patients usually taking these drugs for more than 6 months to 1 year, there they will see an actual size reduction in the prostate gland on sonography. These drugs do not act in a very short period of time, like in 15 days or anything, there will not be any significant change on the USG parameters. However, if he is taking it for about 6 months to a year, definitely the size of the prostate gland will show a slight reduction. However, the degree of reduction is not very, very great. That means a 100-gram prostate won't fall down to 50 grams. But yes, it will come down to about 70 or 75 grams. And many a times that is enough for the patient to pass urine. The 5-alpha reductase inhibitors and alpha blockers have complementary actions. The alpha reductase inhibitors relieve the static obstruction, that is decrease the gland size, and the alpha blockers relieve the dynamic obstruction. So this is a brief patient flow chart as to how the patient is to be managed on our OPD basis. As we discussed that if he is a relatively young patient, of course BPH is not seen in very commonly in young patients. However, patients who are sexually active, relatively younger, about 50 to 60 years of age, the drug of choice is alfuzosin. They usually have a very strong cardiovascular system also, and hence postural side effect will not be a major side effect. The between 45 to 55 or 60, it will depend on the size of the prostate. If the size is less than 30 grams, only a single drug, an alpha blocker, is sufficient. If the size is more than 30 grams, only then a combination therapy is prescribed. Because if there is no gland, there is nothing to shrink. Hence, addition of 5-alpha reductase is not recommended if the size is not more than 30 grams. And of course, in elderly patients with other comorbidities, similarly, if the size is less, only a single drug like silodosin is more effective. And of course, if the gland size is more, then a combination with dutasteride or finasteride is added. That is a combination therapy. This is again a similar chart which is showing basis on the complaints, that is IPSS is less than 7. If the prostate is small, PSA is low, we generally follow no treatment or watchful waiting, what we have said. If the prostate is large, the PSA is on the higher side, then we give a preventive therapy with 5-alpha reductase, that is dutasteride or finasteride, which will eventually result in the decrease in the size of the prostate. If the patient is symptomatic, moderate to severe symptoms, again if the gland size is small, then we give a monotherapy with alpha blocker. If the gland size is large, we add a combination therapy. So this completes our medical management part, and I will just brush up a little on the surgical treatment, because prostate surgery is actually one of the most commonly carried out surgeries for us and also for the population in general. So the surgery indications can be divided into absolute and relative indications. So coming to the absolute indications means that patient is not going to be cured without surgery. Those are known as absolute indications. These patients cannot be managed medically and surgery is indicated in patients with refractory urinary retention. That is, patient with urinary retention even after removal of the catheter after a few days, who are going into repeated retention, they require surgery. Chronic urinary retention with raised serum creatinine level, bilateral hydroureteronephrosis due to back pressures. Every time the sonography is showing a gross residual urine of more than 200 ml, these are the patients who will not do well on medical management and hence surgery will be recommended. Other associated complications like stone formation in the urinary bladder, which happens due to stasis, is an indication, absolute indication for surgery. Recurrent UTI not attributable to any other cause is an indication for surgery. Recurrent gross hematuria after excluding all the other common causes like tumors, stones, etc. is usually due to prostate and is an indication for surgery. And of course, very large bladder diverticuli which hamper the emptying of the bladder is also an indicator for surgery. The other relative indications for surgery in which the patients may or may not be managed medically are patients with severe IPSS score, that is patients with severe symptoms, but not in retention or any of the other complications which we discussed. Failed medical management, or patient is not very happy taking medicines for a long time, or if he feels his complaints are not improving, then he may be better off with the surgery. The flow rate on a uroflowmetry, which is persistently very low, that is less than 10 ml per second, or repeatedly high post-void residue on sonography is also an indication for surgery. So the indications will depend on the patient itself. Apart from the absolute indications, the other indications need to be discussed with the patient, and then surgery has to be offered to him. The types of surgical method are usually the endoscopic method and the open method. Of course, endoscopic is the most commonly done surgery nowadays. Is the TURP. TURP is transurethral resection of the prostate. TUIP is transurethral incision of the prostate, which is in a very small gland. And also the laser incision of the prostate nowadays, which has come into vogue, is the HOLEP laser, that is the holmium laser, a free beam laser, contact laser, which is a KTP laser, interstitial laser like a thulium fiber laser, and all these lasers are there in the market. The other minimally invasive treatments like tuna, HIFU, or microwave therapy or prostatic stents are usually not done nowadays. They used to be done in the olden times when the methods for TURP or the other things were not very well developed. However, with the advent of TURP, all these have now become almost obsolete. The open method of surgery are the commonly done retropubic prostatectomy by like Millins, the perineal prostatectomy or the Young's prostate, transvesical or the Freyers, and of course a laparoscopic and a robot assisted prostatectomy. But nowadays normally all these open surgeries are not done. TURP, that is transurethral resection of the prostate, is still considered as the gold standard of surgical treatment for benign prostatic hyperplasia. The indications for open surgery, a brief overview, that is a very large prostate gland, 100, 120, 150 grams. Rarely do we see patients with 200, 250 grams also. That becomes an indication for open surgery. Any other condition which may necessitate open surgery, like a large bladder diverticulum, a very large hard stone which cannot be fragmented inside the bladder using our laser, then that is an indication for open surgery. And of course, a patient profile in which a lithotomy position cannot be given due to severe ankylosing spondylitis of the hip joint, or maybe a severe kyphoscoliosis of the spine in which the patient cannot be placed in a lithotomy position, then an alternative or a open surgery can be done. So this completes my presentation, a brief overview and management. And if there is anything to discuss, then we can now discuss.
That was a nice and lucid presentation, Anirudh. The question.
Thank you.
Can I start with the questions, Ignesh sir?
Yes, please.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay.
One of the questions is asked by Dr. Mukesh Sejpal, whether you do a total PSA or free PSA.
Yes.
Yeah.
Normally, when we advise a serum PSA, by default, what is done is a total PSA.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
that 0 to 4 range is usually of the total PSA, what we generally discuss and what we generally see in the reports.
Right.
Total free PSA is a part of the PSA, and the ratio is also compared, but that is to be done in very selected cases, like a patient with a PSA between 4 to 10 who may have a suspicion for prostate cancer. Sometimes the patient comes to us with a PSA of 7, but clinically he is like moderate symptoms, and on examination the gland doesn't feel very hard like a malignant gland. Then that is the time when we order a free PSA. So what we ask is the total PSA, free PSA, and the ratio of the free to total PSA. The ratio, if it is less than 0.25 or 25, it usually goes in favor of malignancy, and if the ratio is more, then it usually goes in favor of a benign enlargement. This is to decide whether further action like a prostatic biopsy needs to be done for that patient to exclude a carcinoma of the prostate. Because biopsy, after all, is an invasive procedure, not very comfortable for the patient. So to decide whether biopsy is needed or not, we do a total by free PSA, and then we decide on our further course of action. Routinely, a total PSA is sufficient.
Right, sir. So that means you mean to say that prostatic PSA between 4 to 10 is the one which is a gray zone.
Yes, it is a gray zone.
That part you require free PSA to ratio.
Yes.
Another question by Dr. Rashida. Any specific instructions for patients before they go for serum PSA levels, like to avoid sex or avoid masturbation, etc.?
Yes. We have already discussed the causes of raised PSA. Generally what instructions we give is at least 48 hours of remaining abstaining from ejaculation. Also, if the patient is in acute retention of urine, many a times either we collect the sample prior to catheterization, or if catheterization has been done in an emergency, then we wait for 48 to 72 hours and then we send the serum PSA.
Okay.
Also, these patients usually have a component of urinary tract infections also. So a urine routine which is very normal is an absolute indicator. The urine report should be normal, because there is no point in doing a serum PSA in an infected urine. It is bound to be raised and will give rise to false positive results.
So you can call that.
Exclude the UTI, recent ejaculation, and any instrumentation.
Right. So you can call that patient after 10 to 15 days and again repeat a PSA, or
Yes, that can be done. If the initial value is very high, we can treat the infection and then repeat the PSA.
One more question from Dr. Vinayak Desai. Sir has requested whether you can say something in brief about CA prostate. Like when you are operating a patient of when you do TURP and the slices which you send turn out
Yes.
carcinoma of the prostate. So what do you
Correct.
do at that time?
See, nowadays practically this scenario happens very rarely because almost 100% of the patients do come with a serum PSA level to us. And the incidence in patients with a normal serum PSA, the incidence of harboring a cancer is less than 1%. However, we do come across cases occasionally, especially elderly males, around about 75, 80, in which the PSA is not done routinely. They come for TURP, and many a times we find incidentally detected cancer of the prostate. Coming to its further management, it will all depend on the grade of the cancer, whether it is a high grade, moderate, or a low grade cancer. And then we do a serum PSA maybe after 3 to 4 weeks after surgery. Depending on the stage and the grade of cancer, further treatment is offered to the patient. In patients who are relatively young, who are fit, and who are diagnosed cancer beforehand, before surgery itself, there are various options available depending on the stage, which may be like radical prostatectomy, which can be done by open or robotic or laparoscopic methods, or radiotherapy. And in cases with locally advanced disease or metastatic disease, the best treatment is a hormone therapy or the androgen deprivation. Or in patients who are not fit for surgery, or elderly patients, more than 75, 80 years, they will not be considered for surgery. In such patients, simple hormonal deprivation will do the needful. But of course, management of cancer is a multifactorial approach, and it will all depend on the patient profile, the grade, the stage of the disease, and
Patient choice as well, sir.
sorry,
Patient's choice as well.
patient's choice. Yes.
Yes. There are many questions like drug interaction of silodosin and tamsulosin, alfuzosin. I think you already
Correct.
explained that.
Yes, usually there is no significant drug interaction with the commonly used anti-diabetics, antihypertensives, or the cardiac medications, which are the patients commonly take in this age group. There are no significant drug interactions.
And one more question from my side, sir. You said one of the side effects of silodosin is retrograde ejaculation.
Yes.
If you want to stop silodosin, how long the effect will be there, and how the effect will subside after how much time?
Yes, these drugs are very rapidly acting and with a very short half-life.
Right.
So even after stopping silodosin, within 48 to 72 hours, the effects usually start reversing.
Okay.
It is usually about 3 half-lives, so that is between 3 to 4 days. 72 hours, the effects start reversing.
And Dr. Kalpana has asked one question. While doing a TURP, how much percentage of prostate is removed?
Well, that will actually depend on the size of the gland and the endoscopic appearance of the obstruction. Many a times, what we need to establish is a patent channels for the patient to pass urine. The prostate is never removed fully in a TURP. However, we remove the prostate and the glandular tissue till the capsule is seen. We do not go beyond the capsule. So it will all depend on the size of the gland. So roughly we can say about 70 to 75% of the gland will be removed, and about 20 to 25% which will be adherent to the capsule will remain intact. So even on sonography, even after surgery, because the capsule is intact, since the sonography calculates a volume, the size may be similar to what was seen pre-operatively. However, the channel inside will be patent.
Right, right. So one more thing. After patients do come that they have been operated for TURPs, prostatectomy done, they come after 10 years, 15 years with the similar symptoms which they had before. So what is the treatment in that type of patients?
Yes, this is to be treated as a new patient, and we have to evaluate in detail as we have already discussed, and it is to be managed as a case of BPH, because as I said, in TURP the whole gland is not removed. As the age increases, the gland will eventually start enlarging in size, and 10% out of the patients who have been operated will develop complaints over a period of next 10 years. So 10% is the rate of repeat surgery at the end of 10 years.
End of 10 years.
Yes.
So one more question. So when suggest a patient to do a urodynamic study, when this type of patient come, when we see many patients with LUTS and
Yes.
symptoms.
So correct.
Just to do urodynamic study.
See, the indications for urodynamics is basically when our diagnosis is in doubt. Whether when we cannot classify that the symptoms of the patients are entirely due to enlarged prostate, which can happen in cases of Parkinson's disease, cerebrovascular accidents, even in long-standing cases of diabetes due to diabetic neuropathy, where the bladder itself is hampered, the contractility of the bladder is hampered. On sonography, it is showing a very small size of the prostate, but the patient is severely symptomatic. These are the cases where we opt for a urodynamic study to know whether the obstruction is actually there in the prostate or whether the bladder is at fault due to detrusor atonia or detrusor hypotonia, in which case the surgery will not be of any benefit to the patient. These are the cases where urodynamics is usually asked for.
Post TURP, what is the percentage of patients having retrograde ejaculation?
100%.
100%. That you have to explain.
100%, because we actually cut the bladder neck.
Right. That you have to
And that cannot be reversed unless the prostate regrows.
Yes, right, sir. Any more questions from this side? So that's all. Okay. Dr. Ninad has one question. Right.
Yes.
I already answered that. After Foley's catheterization, the PSA increases after Foley's catheterization? I think you already answered that.
Yes, we generally ask to wait for 2 to 3 days and then go for a serum PSA.
Yeah. Any more questions? Jignesh sir, over to you.
Okay, so I think so. No any more questions are remaining. Sir, it is a very informative and interactive question answer session. So thank you, Dr. Anirudh Gokhale sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Shrenik Shah sir. Now here I am requesting our chairperson, Dr. Ninad Narkar sir, to give the vote of thanks. Ninad sir, please. Ninad sir, please. Hello. Ninad sir.
Ninad sir, unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself, sir.
Hello.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
hello.
That was a very enlightening lecture by Dr. Anirudh Gokhale, and we thank him for making this wonderful presentation and giving a brief insight into this common problem. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Ninad Narkar, sir. Dear friends, today is the 8th webinar of our series, and Dr. Anirudh, sir, is given an excellent lecture to us and updating our knowledge about the
Thank you.
hypertrophy management in our routine general practice. So, thank you, Dr. Anirudh, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for the
Sir,
opportunity.
Dr. Ninad, sir, Dr. Varsha madam, and Dr. Vinayak, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
I thanks to Team DMA, all participants who took the active part in today's webinar series. Behalf of Dahisar Medical Association, here I announce the end of the today webinar session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.